Right, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm really honoured to be here. I can't tell you how honoured I am. It's a fantastic series and conference that's being put on here. And I've had a day here at CCCB, and I've been terribly impressed with everything, and I've been to a great exhibition, and actually by sheer coincidence, in London just a couple of days ago, I thought I'd go and see the Big Bang Data exhibition, which was fantastic, and lots of people in London are talking about it. And I got to the end and realised that it was co-sponsored and co-organised by this very institution. So, as I say, thank you very much for inviting me, Judith. I'm really pleased to be here. The topic of my talk today is on the relationship between technology and time. And this is a very long-standing interest of mine because I'm a sociologist of work, an employment sociologist, and I've been interested for many decades as an economic sociologist in the writings of Marx and Fordism and E.P. Thompson and all the people who talked about how important clocks were, watches were, for the development of industrial capitalism, and all those stories about how peasants had to be taught when they went into factories to keep time, and that watches were a disciplining mechanism. And in fact, I always take my students to the British Museum, where they have a wonderful horology department, and the students there can look at old clocks and look at how relatively recent clocks had pendulums, and how recent it is that we have even the notion of a second hand of a second, of being able to keep time so accurately. And so given how relatively recent this is, I'm very struck by this widespread perception now that somehow the pace of everyday life is getting faster and faster, that we live faster than we used to, that we live in an acceleration society. And whether people are thinking about high-speed trading or speed dating, it seems that everything is spinning faster. And no wonder then that everyone talks about how busy they are. Everyone's pressed for time, everybody's terribly busy. We're also constantly told that the rate of technological development is itself accelerating, that technological innovation is accelerating, and that these two things are linked, that our feelings of being pressed for time and technology accelerating are somehow causally linked. And that's what I want to unpack really in this lecture today. Now, if we believe the cyber gurus of Silicon Valley, all this speed is going to make our lives much better. We'll be able to do things more efficiently, we'll be able to do lots of things on time, faster. And these devices are sold to us all the time as time-saving devices that are promoting an action-packed lifestyle. There's a technological fix for everything, endless apps for time management that promote and free up time. I mean, just look at this iWatch that the iPhone that some of you may already have. I read a piece in the Financial Times, which is, the British business paper about this, and they were talking about the wonderful accelerated 3D touch interface. And what they said when they were reviewing this iPhone was that it saves seconds. Every time you use it, it saves seconds. They say Apple refuses to say what the S in its iPhone update stands for because it's known as the 6S. But speed really must be, they say, what the S stands for. All that time saved by its accelerated interface probably adds little to the sum of human productivity. But we're now so used to instant digital gratification that the iPhone brings swift satisfaction to our impatient fingers. And whether it's the iWatch, whether it's the self-logging bracelets that lots of people are wearing, or even liquid food, I found this little article that amused me about some Californian IT geeks, and they've even resorted to liquid food to save time. Why spend time eating? We can mash it all up into one thing, and they're now selling this in San Francisco. I can't imagine where else there'd be a market for these things, but in San Francisco, saving time is at the premium. And it seems to me that a lot of the current obsession with the self-driving car is also about this promise of maximising time. I think it's become the iconic technology, in fact, a future of self-driving cars. Now, I'm interested in the idea of acceleration, not just because it's a lifestyle trend, but because there's a whole lot of social theory. There's a lot of social theory at the moment being written about the idea that somehow we're entering a new consciousness of time, that we're entering a new temporality. And what's interesting about social theorists, I mean, there's huge differences between these social theorists, and so I apologise for just putting them all up there at once. But I think what's quite interesting is that there's different concepts there: timeless time, instantaneous time, network time, lots of different concepts, but they all really have a similar idea. And your own Manuel Castells is one of the best-known theorists of this. His Network Society book is very well known everywhere. It's endlessly cited. And in that book, he talks about us witnessing the end of what he calls linear clock time, that industrial time is linear clock time, but we're now entering a new epoch, a digital epoch, in which time disappears altogether. It's as if the speed of digital technology is annihilating time. Now, as I said, these theorists differ in many important ways, but I think they have a lot of things in common. I think one thing they have in common is that they share this idea that speed is the defining characteristic of contemporary life. They all posit and assume that what's driving this speed is digital technology. That's what's driving the speed. And interestingly, they all have a rather negative view of this. They all think that a lot of aspects of acceleration are actually socially destructive. It's a cautionary tale about speed, and it has an uncanny resemblance to a lot of the more popular literature. I used to buy every single book that came out about digital distraction, digital detox, about the effects of technology. I can't keep up with them now because I think every week now a book comes out bemoaning the fact that, you know, we're distracted, we're busy, giving us advice about how to deal with these things. And in all these books, even Sherry Turkle's books, which I like very much, and she's got a more recent book that Alone Together called Reclaiming Conversation, she again says that the hyperconnectivity of digital devices is the problem. It's killing conversation, killing relationships. We need to sort of get away with it. And a lot of the solution that you often find in these books is actually to have what's now known as a digital detox or a digital diet. You know, go off the grid, lock up the machines, and return to a more authentic, natural life. I mean, I gather you had Evgeny Morozov here at some point or other. He always talks about the fact that to do his writing, he has to lock up his phone, and he's got some system where even if he wants to get at it, he can't, because it's got some automated locking system. He can't possibly get at it. And I was very amused when I read that a national park in Britain, sort of to the west of London, had set up a tech creche, and I read about this. And they advertised this, you know, come for a day to this park. It's a forest, you know, forest near London, where you and your family can surrender your digital devices and car keys, so you lock it all up and you skip off for a tech-free day. They say in the ad, enjoy activities from days of old, like chatting, making eye contact, and not Googling things you wonder about. Say, we'll Google later. Just look at the goddamn birds, you know. I think there's lots of different versions of this, and what I want to argue is that much of this writing about the relationship between technology and speed is still implicitly technological determinist. I mean, most academics, including Castells, will absolutely say that they're not technological determinists, but actually I think if you read their writings, in all these stories, somehow the driver is technology. We're somehow hostages to the accelerating speed of machines. And it's as if the technology itself is driving the fast pace of life. Now, as a sociologist, I very much argue that this contemporary imperative of speed is as much a cultural artefact as it is a technological one. That if we feel rushed and pressed for time, it's because of the priorities and parameters we set ourselves rather than the machines per se. In other words, in a field of sociology that I do called Science and Technology Studies, or STS for short, we very much now think about technology as inseparable from society. We think about technology as a socio-material practice, and that we always have acted, humans and machines have always acted together with machines, that one can't even understand time without understanding all the technologies through which we mediate time, through which we experience time. That we actually understand time itself with and through machines, that you can't abstract machines out of time. And taking up this position leads me then to ask in the book, well, if this is the case, how has acceleration come to signify the zeitgeist? How has it somehow become the quintessential experience of modernity? How has speed, acceleration, gained so much legitimacy? And finally, what are the political implications of this? And I'm going to end this lecture by questioning the assumption that the fastest technologies are necessarily the best technologies. Okay, before I go on, I just want to remind you, and I'm sure all of you will be well aware of this, that we're not unique in human history and in thinking that our period is one of unprecedented acceleration, like it's the first time it's ever happened. If you look back in history, you find very quickly that there's always, that big technological changes have always been accompanied by shifts between exhilaration and alarm, celebration and fear, anxiety and hope. And I think the massive inventions of the 19th century provoked very similar debates to the debates we're having today. And there's some wonderful books in particular on the telegraph, comparing the telegraph to the internet, and talking about how when the telegraph was introduced, there was a great discussion about the collapse of time and space, about the annihilation of time, and also about the disorienting effect speed would have on our consciousness. That if you'd never been in a train before and you were suddenly in a train, how disorienting this would be. And as a sociologist, I immediately go back to George Zimmel's writings in 1900 about the period in which cities first grew up and people from the countryside went into the cities and they experienced the speed of the city as being incredibly disorienting. And Zimmel actually writes in 1900 about this modern time consciousness of the city as being one involving immediacy, simultaneity, and presentism. And when I read that, I just thought, isn't that exactly, aren't they exactly the words that are used by contemporary social theorists to describe our unique time consciousness? So in contrast to a lot of macro social theory, I'd argue that there's a lot of continuity. I'm not saying that there aren't new things, but I think it's very important to keep in mind continuity, not only in terms of technology, and by that I mean that we're using all kinds of technologies all the time that we take for granted, that we don't think of, the lighting, the electricity, there's heaps of technologies that we're not having great conversations about because we've naturalized them, they're just part of the infrastructure, we don't even reflect on them anymore. But also the continuity, as I've said, in terms of these debates about moral panics and messianic hopes. What's important during this period, though, and I noticed, I've just been to see the exhibition that's on here, and I noticed this was actually written in the exhibition, that this is the period, though, in which speed becomes identified with progress, that what progress means becomes associated with speed. So I think it's really a mistake to think that there's some acceleration that is a uniform, universal process that is dominating all aspects of life. I think you can only think that if you give far too much power to technology. And a lot of these social theorists say that they're discussing a politics of time, but what's missing in a lot of this writing is lived time, is time not in terms of great historical epochs, but in terms of the everyday mundane time of everyday life, which is structured in political, economic, and social contexts. And if you think about our everyday lives, in reality, we live a multiple of temporalities, a multiplicity of temporal textures and rhythms, which vary in intensity depending on what we're doing, where we're doing things, and with whom we're doing things. I mean, just take the example of quality time with children. I mean, that's a kind of time that is a special kind of time. And according to all of the statistics, the amount of time mothers and fathers are spending with their children is actually greater than it ever was before, not less. And what's even more interesting, I think, that the sociology, that empirical sociology that studies these things, shows that the time people are spending with their children is much more active. And what sociologists mean when they say that is that active parenting means talking and playing with children, not just having them in the background. And I think about this a bit in terms of, you know, that I have written a lot in my life as a Marxist about the intensification of work, but there's very little written about the intensification of parenting, the heightened expectations of modern parenting, and how time intensive that sort of parenting is. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that speed is only part of a dialectic. And while I think it's true that some things are speeding up, I think other aspects of life may well be slowing down, and I think this quality parenting time might be an example of that. I think this is the only way really to account for what seems like a paradox in the time use literature, what's known as the time pressure paradox, which is the gap between people's perceptions of having less time and actually the behavioural data. And I know this is, I mean, people always say there's, you know, English and American sociologists are absolutely fetishistic about empirical data and empirical studies, and so am I. But I think it's the only way to undercut a lot of these narratives and rhetorics is to really look at behavioural data. And what you find if you look at this data is that the amount of leisure time people have has not hugely changed over the last 50 years. Now, it's absolutely true that it differs between different groups. And of course, professionals and managers who work very long hours are very different than the unemployed and part-time workers and people who work few hours. But if you look at the sort of macro data, what you find is that actually over 50 years, the amount of time people spend sleeping and eating and leisure, it hasn't changed that dramatically. And I know you're going to tell me that there's lots of books now, because I read these books, like the book 24/7 by Crary, that assert that people are sleeping less, you know, and people are walking faster. I do read all these things. I mean, empirically, this just does not seem to be the case. That's all that I say. If you actually look at time use data, at behavioural data, there hasn't been such a huge change. And I think what accounts then for our subjective sense of being busy is not a discussion about the amount of time we have, but much more a discussion about the quality or character of time. And I do think that's what's important about technologies, not the amount of time, but how the technologies may be reshaping the quality of time. I've done a lot of research on mobile phones. I started researching mobile phones, in fact, when mobile phones were new, which isn't that long ago. There was a time people didn't have mobile phones. I didn't have a phone. I was very unsympathetic, I have to say. I was a very late adopter, as we say, of the phone. And I think the phone is is interesting because here we have a technology that's designed as a business tool. It's designed for one thing, and very quickly, mothers in particular start using the phone to call their own mothers and their children, and we have a technology that is immediately taken up as a social technology and very much as a coordinating tool. And I understand the fast diffusion of the mobile phone as not being to do with the intrinsic qualities of the mobile phone, but to do with us shifting to what we sociologists talk about as a desynchronized society. And what we mean by that is that if you contrast working patterns today, shopping patterns today, the fact that people live in two-earner families, that we've shifted away from a traditional working week to much more flexible patterns of doing everything. And what that means is that we're coordinating lots of things, which does add to notions of busyness. And in that context, a mobile phone, a smartphone, is a fabulous coordinating tool. So that's why immediately people got them. And when I started doing this work, I remember a journalist would say to me, "Oh, I can't stand it when people on the train say I'm on the train." You know, that this was the most trivial, I'm on the bus, I'm on the train. But actually, that is what people do a lot. And in fact, I've decided that that's quite an important thing. And I think it's important for coordination because you're telling other family members where you are and when you're arriving. But also, it's important in terms of caring and emotional support. And people underestimate how much, well, I certainly underestimated how much people value what we call perpetual presence, or, you know, being present while physically absent, and that can be very important for relationships. So my point here is that the issue is not so much a shortage of time, but a problem of timing or scheduling. That's what I'm sort of trying to say there. Now, of course, all this is predicated on power relations. And when I'm discussing email, which is something that is endlessly discussed, and again, I read in the papers every day about CEOs get 300 emails a day or 500 emails a day, and, you know, email is taking up this much productivity. It's an obsessive topic in business schools. I always stress that the fact that we feel the need to respond to emails quickly is to do with cultural norms that we've participated in, expectations that you reply quickly. It's not to do with the fact that data transmission is fast. It's to do with appropriate response times. And an individual's ability to resist the pressure of perpetual availability very much depends on the institutional context. I'm sure you've all heard those stories about the email policies of Volkswagen and Daimler in Germany, where they've banned emails at weekends and in the holidays. And I don't even know if this story is true, but everyone loves this story about the supposed Daimler email that said, the person you are sending this to is on holiday. This email will be deleted. If it's important, send it again when the person's back. But I mean, it seems a very iconic, people love this example because of the deletion. You know, can one actually delete things and get away with it and the world doesn't end, and that we could have collective policies to deal with this. Now, it very much depends on the institutional context, and if you work for Google, for example, it's a very different story. I picked up one day in the airport the book called How Google Works by Eric Schmidt and Jonathan Rosenberg, their book on how Google works. And there's actually a section in the book called Overworked in a Good Way. And it's not a joke, overworked in a good way, it says. And in that section, they say that work-life balance policies are insulting to smart employees. They have worked with young mothers, young mums, they say, who go completely dark for a few hours in the evening, and then around 9 p.m. you can rely on them. They're back there, fully focused, doing what they should be doing. The emails start coming in. And the difference in those companies is to do with works councils and workers' organisation, as opposed to being at the mercy of the all-inclusive 24-hour culture of Google, which I will come back to towards the end. So time is lived at the intersection of an array of social differences, in which some people's time is much more valued than other people's time. And in fact, some people gain speed at the expense of other people having to wait and be slow. And so a lot of this discussion about speed, it seems to me, is a discourse, is a rhetoric, rather than a reality for many, many people. Most people in the world are not living at high speed, in fact, and don't fit with this discourse at all. Nevertheless, we're constantly now being invited to work on our time. And having a good relationship with time is more and more equated with having a good relationship with technology. You know, if we've got a good relationship with technology, we'll be on top of time. So does it matter then what kind of technology we have? I think it matters a lot. That's why I do the sociology of technology, because I'm very concerned about the kind of technology we have. And for the last part of my talk, I want to consider the idea that our cultural expectations of speed are actually being fed by innovations, by the way innovations are taking place today. Let me explain what I mean. I think the one area in which we've really bought this story about acceleration is in relation to technological innovation. The sheer speed of innovation is equated with inventiveness, productivity, and efficiency. It's the ultimate measure of progress. We have this deeply held belief that the faster we do things, the more we'll save time. And we're so immersed in this culture of busyness and productivity that it's very hard to step back and think about whether speed should be the ultimate measure of innovation. I argue at some length in the book that it's very important to question this idea that the very best technical design is about maximising efficiency in the sense of being economical with time. And this instrumental philosophy is still at the heart of engineering, in which the latest, fastest, and most automated systems appear to be objectively the best. Let me just give you a few examples. Think about the overriding importance of speed to Google's search engine. Now, when you search things on Google, you just think the speed is fantastic. You don't really sit there and think about what's being sacrificed for the speed, what kind of knowledge is being sacrificed. And one of the stories I often tell when I'm giving talks on gender and technology is the story about how Google actually had to change one of its search engines because it was the case a few years ago that if you typed in "she invented," the autocomplete, the autocorrect, would ask you, do you mean he invented? Now, someone picked this up, and Google absolutely have changed this now. But my point is that the algorithms, it's not that the algorithms have got a gender bias, that people are thinking about gender bias. It's that algorithms always reflect, they're always influenced by the people who design and write them. They're not neutral. They bear the imprint of their designers. Now, I actually thought I would go to Google, because it's around the corner from me in London, and ask them about this autocomplete, being a naive person that I am, and, why is this autocomplete so important, I said. And I wanted to see, anyway, all the coloured, bean bags and all the wonderful things they have in there, so I thought I would go and check it out. So off I went, and the guy said to me, I said, wouldn't it be better if we had more accurate knowledge, even though the search engine was slower? It seemed to me an obvious question to ask. And he said to me, actually, you don't understand the importance of latency, Judy. This is the crucial thing. He said, apparently, even half a second's delay on a search engine, which would occur if you increase the results on a page from 10 to 30, causes a 20% drop in traffic. And all they're interested in is traffic. You know, they make money out of traffic. They want as much traffic as they can get, and they're concerned, therefore, to maximise the speed. So we might think, and I certainly think, that having more diverse search engines, running different algorithms that maybe gave us different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of information might be better, but it would be slower. I also wish that there was more than one Wikipedia. I've just marked a PhD of a student at the Oxford Internet Institute, and the case she took was looking at the amount of African content that's on Wikipedia, but you could do a similar thing in terms of women's interests. She did a study of what are called Wikipedians, the people who put information on Wikipedia. And what do you know? The young guys, that's who on the whole put information on Wikipedia, put stuff up that is stuff they're interested in. They don't especially think we won't have much on Africa, we won't have much on women. So I think in all of these ways, the designs of technology bear the imprint of the designers. Now, we don't often think about this kind of labour, like the Wikipedian labour. I think there aren't nearly enough studies of all of this sort of hidden labour that goes into keeping this new digital world going. This new infrastructure is rarely discussed. And I find this an interesting topic because it reminds me of how long it took feminists to get domestic labour recognised, caring labour, lots of domestic labour, recognised as proper labour, that it was labour that was very much hidden. And I think one can make a bit of a parallel, really, with the way that we talk about technology only in terms of the new snazzy technology that works properly, but yet our experience of technology is that it often isn't smooth, that it breaks down a lot, that we spend ages having to update, new software packages. There's all this stuff going on and we endlessly have to do it. We're upgrading, we're getting used to new software. The technology breaks down, and if we thought a little bit more about the repairing that we have to do and the work we have to do to keep this infrastructure going, we mightn't think that the technology is saving us quite as much time. I think there's lots of ways in which the technology is taking up time, and really we do kind of know this because that's why there's lots of jokes in the theatre and things about phoning up to automatic systems that keep you on for ages, the problem people have with lots of passwords. There's lots of ways in which we never really hear the story. I think that the story about technology and time could be a much more complicated story than the story, the mainstream story we're getting. And there's a very old literature in the 1970s about what was then talked about as the shift to the self-service economy. And people were then talking about bank machines where you could get cash out and going to petrol stations and filling up your own petrol. And somehow this has fallen out of everyday sort of discussion, whereas it seems to me that we've never been in such a self-service economy, but it's a new kind of self-service economy where you have to book your own flights and all this stuff, which is making money for someone else, but is taking up your time. Okay. Now, let me be absolutely clear at this point. I'm not nostalgic for a more natural, less digitised past. I'm not one of those people. I haven't joined the slow food movement or the mindfulness movement, although I know everyone today has been asking me about this, and maybe I'm wrong, so I'm perfectly willing to discuss this. What I'm much more concerned to argue is that we need to be much more discriminating and demanding about the kinds of technologies we want and the values and purposes they might serve. And this involves redefining genuine inventiveness. Thinking about inventiveness is not about speed and novelty, but actually about challenging the assumptions that permeate our scientific discourse. To put it very simply, it means thinking about social problems first and then thinking of technical solutions. And I'm rather disturbed at the moment, for example, that social science is going through what I think of as a big data bubble, that everyone wants to do work with big data, crunch big data because it's available, as if crunching big data doesn't already contain a politics and political implications. I'm also struck by how this discourse of speed and novelty permutates all the sort of radical visions, the technological imaginaries that we get from Silicon Valley, whether it's the Internet of Things or social robotics. It seems to me that these are actually very conservative visions of a different world. I mean, it's a pretense that this world's going to be different, where actually the world they're describing is the world that's exactly the same as the world we're living in today, but with new gizmos. Now, perhaps this is not surprising, given who is designing our technologies in Silicon Valley. Now, I know this is a TV series, so forgive me for that, but I also know that this is accurate. It may be maybe a sitcom, but it's accurate. The most powerful companies in the world now, and a lot of them are here this weekend, Apple, Google, Intel, Microsoft, they're basically engineering companies. And whether it's in the US or Europe or Japan, they still employ very few women, minorities, and people over 40. I gave evidence recently to the House of Lords Committee on Skills in London and looked up the figures on women engineers in Britain, and I'm terribly sorry I don't have the figure for Spain, but in Britain 7% of working engineers are women. And I've argued for many, many years that this inevitably influences the kind of technology that's designed. I mean, this is a Japanese robot that is being designed. It is based on an attractive average body of a young female, and I think the image speaks for itself in terms of what sort of image of a robot, who would be designing this kind of robot, and we can come back to that because I know everyone's always very interested in robotics. More subtly though, I just want to make a last couple of points. More subtly though, Silicon Valley plays a key role in promoting this workaholic, frenetic culture more generally. I read a terrific book by an anthropologist in New York by Emily Martin called Bipolar Expeditions. And it's all about manic depression. And one of the things she talks about in the book is how somehow the fluctuating tides of hyper-energy and manicness have now become valorized as desirable qualities. That people like Steve Jobs and Ted Turner, these people that we now look up to as the entrepreneurial geniuses, are always described as staying up all night, being completely hyper. Whenever I read accounts in the Sunday newspapers in Britain of there's a new company called DeepMind that is the absolute forefront of artificial intelligence. The description of the lead guy, the genius in this company, always talks about working 24/7, always. That's what you have to do to be a genius, to have cutting-edge ideas. And I think we have to sort of counter this notion that sort of lifestyle is genius and that these disruptive technologies are actually the height of creativity and inventiveness. My final point is that this culture of speed also works against having deliberative discussions about the future of technology. That we're endlessly told that because technology itself is accelerating, how can we possibly in Europe or anywhere have the time to have citizens participating in a proper deliberative discussion about what do we want to invest in, what sort of responsible science and technology do we want to have. So I think it's important to counter this speed discourse for that reason as well, to make space actually for deliberation. So just to conclude, I would argue that our sense of time has always been intimately bound up with objects, always, and that digital time is no different. Ultimately, it needs to be understood as a product of the ways in which we humans use, interact with, and indeed build technology. If we want to be more in control of our time in the sense of having discretionary time, then we need to counter this cult of speed and harness our inventiveness to fashion an alternative politics of time. And there's a great book by Helga Novotny, a Viennese social scientist, who wrote a book on time in 1989, a very prescient book, where she says, any capacity to participate depends on the power and control one has over one's time. Anyway, I'd just like to end by telling you that I went for a walk today down the road, and I happened upon the mobile conference, and so I got myself into a venue and had a little look around the venue. And one of the things I observed was that there were some poles that had data on that were going up and down. And anyway, I took a slide of one of them, which I thought just so summed up what the mobile conference was about. I thought this was fantastic, and I came over on the plane with lots of people talking about new apps and how to maximise time. And this seems to sort of sum up for me the selling point of what mobiles are sort of selling is speed. It's speed, time efficiency. Anyway, thank you.